A Return to Sanity by Scott Mason. I used to really enjoy Chris Matthews. As a guy who once made a living in the Beltway working for President Jimmy Carter and House Speaker Tip O'Neill, Matthews offered interesting insight into the inner workings of Washington and its top newsmakers. Yeah, he was loud as hell, talked over guests too much, and seemed far too impressed with his own opinions. But his show never lacked good guests, and his opinions, while somewhat left of center, were generally reasonable and independent-minded. Then, somewhere between the beginning of the Bush presidency and the now infamous "I've got a tingle up my leg" quote about Barack Obama, the Chris Matthews I liked disappeared, replaced by a knee-jerk reactionary hyper-partisan liberal who didn't seem at all out of place on a network that had slowly turned itself into the left-wing's version of Fox. Sometimes I'd think about what had happened to the Matthews I remember and wondered whether or not he'd ever return. Turns out I may have gotten my answer Tuesday night. Following the stunning election of Scott Brown as the first Republican senator from Massachusetts since the year the world was introduced to Marlon Brando as Don Corleone, I flipped the channel to MSNBC, expecting to hear a chorus of anchors and guests acting like a kid who just found out his dog had died while simultaneously throwing insults at Brown and the, quote, rubes who voted for him. Instead, I ended up watching an interesting conversation between Rachel Maddow and Chris Matthews. But imagine my surprise when, as the argument unfolded, rather than preaching to the choir, Maddow found herself arguing with the old Chris Matthews. Quote, "I think the debt's a real problem," Matthews said. "I think when this candidate came along and talked about taxes, he was really talking about other things. He was talking about worries about overkill in terms of government spending. I think they're worried about it. I don't think it's irrational." End quote. After Maddow said she thought it was irrational and said all it showed her was that the Democrats simply needed to get better about talking about their own fiscal responsibility, Matthews stood firm and continued to argue his point. Quote, "No, I look at the numbers and I'm worried. I'm worried about this government committing itself to so many entitlement programs and committing itself to such a level of taxation to support those entitlement programs." End quote. When Maddow insisted that Obama has cut taxes, Matthews countered that by saying that we can all see the higher taxes coming. Maddow shot back that you can't vote for somebody because you think taxes might go up and claimed that anybody who is against health care reform is anti-deficit reduction because the CBO says it will reduce the deficit. Matthews was ready for that one too. Quote, "They've got a health care plan in their state. They know cost figures are never reliable. There's always overrun. They know government always underestimates the cost of programs." End quote. Maddow ended the segment by saying that the voters didn't vote on policy and that they were totally divorced from reality. Right, because anybody who disagrees with Rachel Maddow's worldview is clearly living in a dream world. Now, a couple of thoughts here. First, it was good to see the old independent-minded Chris Matthews back. Hopefully, he's here to stay. Second, a few quick rebuttals to some of Rachel Maddow's banter that I just can't let slide. Rachel Maddow claimed that Barack Obama cut taxes. His, quote, tax cut was merely a temporary rebate along the lines of the one George W. Bush gave us in 2008. It was not a permanent change in the tax code. Further, he raised the federal cigarette tax by 159% already, and according to ABC's Jake Tapper, President Obama's budget calls for tax increases beginning in 2011 that amount to nearly $1 trillion on individuals and businesses. So, of course, in addition to giggling like a schoolgirl when Maddow claims Obama is a, quote, tax cutter, you can also giggle when she says people can't vote against somebody because they see future tax increases coming for two reasons. A tax cut is only a tax cut if you cut spending with it, otherwise it's just a tax loan. And B, you don't need a crystal ball to see if Obama will raise taxes because it's already right there clear as day in his budget. Also, I'd like to address her claim that the CBO says the health care bill will reduce the deficit. Putting aside the fact that the contents of the bill seem to change more often than Mitt Romney's position on abortion, Peter Suderman of Reason magazine points out that the CBO score is based on Medicare cuts that everybody knows will never happen, and the Democrats are using a cheap accounting trick. They're projecting costs across a decade when the costs don't kick in until 2014. As Suderman explains, quote, "If you decided to add the cost of a gym membership to your budget next year at $100 a month, it would cost you $1,200 for the year. But if you decided to wait until July to join, the cost would only be $600 in next year's budget." Pretty cheap, right? Well, not really, because the following year and every year after, the membership would cost you the full $1,200. That's basically what the Democrats are doing here. End quote. course, you can add to that Matthews' larger point that government programs always underestimate costs. See Social Security, Medicare, and the already mentioned Massachusetts healthcare program. Finally, Maddow's claim that Republicans claiming to be fiscally responsible is ridiculous. That's true. But her belief that Democrats simply need to be better about explaining their own fiscal responsibility is a joke, too. Republicans spent us into an oblivion and jacked up the deficit, but Barack Obama's stimulus alone will add more to the deficit than President Bush's first 3 years combined. And that's just the stimulus. That doesn't take into account any other spending this year or any other spending in future years. As a friend of mine likes to say, it's as if Bush threw a house party and wrecked your house, so you hired Obama to come in and clean up the mess. He took one look around and said, screw it. Let's throw an even bigger party. The fact is, just because the Republicans screwed up royally doesn't mean that the Democrats haven't been just as bad or worse. It also doesn't mean that the Republicans should be trusted either, but it does mean that having a more closely divided two-party government is better than giving either side a blank check. It appears as if Chris Matthews may finally be starting to see that. Thankfully, it looks like most of the rest of the country is starting to see it too.